Hi, my name is Life Master Arthur Braden. I'm going over Philidor's position, suggestively one of the two most important rook and pawn versus rook endgames. The other one is the Lucena position. Um, and I want to point out some issues that you might come across, and especially given that there is a certain approach we want to take to studying endgames. So here, here's the position, and you can see that the white pawn is ready to advance, the white king is ready to advance, and of course, in this position, almost every chess player would say white's goal is to eventually advance the pawn, make a queen, and so black, of course, their job is to present some difficulty to try to prevent white from advancing the pawn or getting the king, moving the king up smoothly and supporting the pawn. And you can see that one of black's difficulties is that his king is very passive. His king is in the back rank, and so the move that everybody mentions is always rook to a6. Okay, so that's the first move, and they always in the Philidors they say, okay, we cut the king off. When the king and the pawn have made it to 5th rank, we cut the king off, we get the rook to the 6th rank, and we prevent the pawn from advancing. Or prevent the king from advancing. The pawn, of course, has to do what? The pawn is going to have to advance first. Or we keep black's purpose is to keep the king cut off until white finally decides, perhaps begrudgingly, okay, I guess I really do have to advance the pawn. And then once white does advance the pawn, then black's drawing method is to move the rook all the way back. Okay? And the idea is that now the king can't move in directly and closely to both corner the black king and support the pawn at the same time. Black has these checks in the back rank, so white has no chance to hide from the checks with that pawn in exactly that position. You can see the king, that there's no way that white can make any progress, because the moment they try to push their king forward to try to threaten the king, the enemy king, then black just checks from behind. So that's the overall idea of the Philidors. But there is, from this position, even though this is the Philidors position, there are several other issues. One of them is that most moves here do draw for black. There's not really, even though this is a typical method that they mentioned, almost every move draws for black. The only couple of moves of note that we might as well look at is that black could play here, and that would be losing, or black could play here, and that would be losing. But almost every other move that black can play is going to be a draw. Okay, and obviously there's obvious moves that are going to lose, like there, you're not going to give away your rook here or here or here. Those are we won't even consider anyway. But let's suppose, for example, black plays a losing move here. Okay, a move that on the surface of it looks pretty good. Looks like, hey, we're going to prevent the white pawn from advancing. We're keeping that stopped. And so how can white make progress? Well, if white moves his king in, then obviously he's going to be checked away, right? He's going to check him and push him back. So the only way he's going to make progress is to move his king here. But let's see how that works. Well, now he's already threatening to push the pawn. And if black tries to move the rook and check him, then white just pushes the pawn and is already threatening mate. And I think you could tell that black's in a bad way. Black's about ready to lose. And let's go ahead and take a look at that, and then we'll back up to the other possibilities. He pushes the pawn, and then now since white's threatening mate, what's black's going to most likely do? Yeah, he's going to move the 8th rank or try to block the check this way. Okay, so if he moves the 8th rank to stop the checkmate, okay, then what can we do? We could push the pawn, but that's a classic mistake, because then black's just going to do what? Black's just going to, what would you say, Alex? If I push the pawn here, why is that a mistake? Black can just check him. And it's just going to push the king away. And if he can keep pushing the king away like that, obviously we're not going to make progress, right? So pushing the pawn is a mistake. We can't advance the rook and mate him. But the one thing that since we have room to do it, notice, on the far side. If we didn't have room, that would be an issue. But I can just move my rook over here. Now, if my king was already over in the rook file, of course, something like this wouldn't be possible. But if I go over here and threaten check, then what's happening? Well, can you tell that black is going to lose no matter what?
Yes.
Is that easy to tell?
Yes.
Right.
Lose the rook.
Threatening may, or lose the rook if the king moves away. So this is not even worth analyzing anymore, right? Okay, so let's back this up. So obviously, when white moved his king forward, okay, we don't want to check them from the side. That's a mistake. Okay, what else can we do? Well, we could try what they normally try in the Philidor's position. We say, okay, well, now the king's moved forward, maybe we can move the rook down, okay, and get ready to check him from behind. Because you're always in rook and pawn endgames looking for, well, what is the effectiveness of me checking them on the side? What is the effectiveness of me checking it from the back, right? Right, Alex? Okay. And so white would try the obvious. Well, he could try pushing the pawn, okay? But that really would give black what? Black would simply draw by just checking him. In fact, now we have that same Philidor's position idea. We've managed to get him to push the pawn so that his king has no mobility, and if we try to check him from behind, he can't like hide behind the pawn. So that doesn't work. Okay, so let's back up. Okay, or excuse me. If the rook goes forward like this again, let's try this again. So if we can't push the pawn, what can white do to try to win this? What do you think, Alex? Is white really in any position to try to win, or should he just go ahead and take the draw?
Oh, I think you're threatening the mate with bringing the king to e6.
Okay, but do you remember why that was a problem before? Before we were talking about putting the king right here, but we said that that was actually a mistake. That didn't really help us because black can just do what?
Oh, black can go in
check from the side, right? So you have, and sometimes they call those lateral checks or checks from the side versus checks from behind. So you're always looking as both a defender and an attacker. You're looking at how effective are the checks from behind, how effective are they from the side. So this is a waste of time. So we can't push the pawn, we can't push the king here. Okay. Apparently, moving these is not helping me. So my last chance to try to win this is to move the rook. So this check, you want to try that. Is this check going to do anything for me? What do you think?
Yeah, I think so, because it's going to push the black king further away from the white king.
Yeah, the king has to move
and then we have a check
further away. Yeah, and then we can follow it up with check. Does that sound reasonable?
Yep.
And now what? Well, if black's going to offer resistance, he can't just like move away, because then we'll do what?
Yeah, we'll keep on pushing.
Yeah, we'll just push the pawn, and then there's, even if he keeps checking my king around, let's say he checks it there, what am I going to do? I'm just going to, what do you think?
To G7.
Okay. Yeah, I can move to G7, and then he checks me here.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah, see, if my king stays in these three files, can you see he just keeps on checking me? Unless my king is where on these three files? There's three files here. Well, if my king starts walking back, you see it?
Yes.
While he's checking me, because I'm always threatening to queen. He never can move the king back and stop because I queen. He can't move the rook over because I queen. The only thing he has left to do is to keep on checking me. Does that make sense?
Yes.
And the only way I can really make a mess of this is if I start moving my king in the same file as my pawn, because he does what?
Check you. Yeah.
He checks me from behind and forces me to defend,
Yeah.
right? Makes sense? Okay. So, and if I come back here, he checks me here. I just keep on coming back, right? And I'm going to win. Make sense? Okay. So now we know that it doesn't do black any good to move away. He's going to have to move up here to try to offer some kind of advantage. Does that make sense? To offer some kind of resistance. Okay. But his king being close does seem to be a problem, because what's going to happen if I push my pawn? What do you think, Alex? Is that going to be okay for me? Am I going to win this now,
Yeah,
like I
white
did last
control,
time?
you win, yeah.
I'm sorry?
If, say that again?
I pushed this pawn here just now,
Okay.
just like I did in the last position.
Okay.
Is this winning for me? What do you think? No.
No, it's not.
He's going to do what? He's just going to check me, and as soon as I move my king away, he's going to what?
Well, it goes behind the.
As soon as he checks me and I move my king away, what's he going to do?
It's going to go behind. It's going to go forward with this king, right?
No? What would you do here in this position?
Okay. So this is black to play here?
Yeah.
I'm going to take the pawn.
Just take the pawn, right? Apparently the white king has a job here, right? He's got to defend the pawn. Okay, so now we know that black's best defensive chance, which is usually the case in even king and pawn in games, right? Is keep the defending king close to the pawns, right? So here, this is the best chance. This is black's best chance. But now we see a difference. The king in the last set of variations was going over here, away from the pawn, and we were just able to push the king. So if we could get the king to move away from the pawn, then we win. Okay? But here he's staying close to the pawn, so what can white do to make sure the king is nowhere near our pawn so we can just advance it and win? What can we do here? Before the king was over here, and that worked out well for us. Okay, so he's cut off. Whereas here, he's on the pawn, he's threatening the pawn, and that it's a problem for us, right?
That's right.
Okay. So what we do here is we just check him. We force his king back to one of the that position where he was, or one of these positions, and then what? And now we just do what to win?
We can just push.
We can just push. And what's going to happen if he starts checking me from behind?
We're going to attack his rook. We've got to keep forward.
Keep moving my king back on these same 3 files away from that pawn, right? The F, G, or H file, right?
Yes.
Okay. So let's go back. So now we see. Now we see why there's a win there if black plays this incorrectly. Okay. So black, you can see now that this is a bad move.
Yeah.
But if the Philidors is just one way to draw, what is another way for black to draw? Let's suppose he makes a casual move, let's say like this. Is that going to draw?
He looks the same to me, yeah.
Okay. Well, there's several ways to try to win. For example, I could try to push the pawn, but why would you pretty quickly dismiss that move? Why don't you think that's probably not going to win for me? It's black's turn now. He's got to assess the checks from behind,
Yes.
and he's got to assess the checks that are the lateral checks, right? Okay, so are any of those any series of checks here preventing white from making progress?
Yeah, we have to.
Yeah, he just starts checking from behind,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
Even if I start bringing my king back, notice he can just
Hit
hit the pawn.
Yes.
Yeah. In fact, it's even more effective. What if he pushes the rook here and hits the pawn? See how effective that is?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now it's really effective because the only way I'm going to do anything now is to push the pawn,
Yeah.
and he's going to do what?
Put the rook behind.
Yeah, just put the rook
There you go.
on the pawn. Okay? Everything is a draw, right? Okay, so now we know that pushing the pawn doesn't do anything. So then we consider, what about pushing the king? And what are some of my king's approaches? For both kings, usually it's a bet. Most of the time, it's a better idea to have the kings next to the pawn, right? So what kind of candidate moves would I consider for this king? Moving this king and helping to advance the pawn where? Oh, my king might move here. My king might move here.
Yeah.
Which one looks better? This one?
Well, this one you're threatening a mate.
Yeah, you're threatening mate. But do you remember why that was so bad a couple
because
different times before? He just checks and pushes us back, right? So the only way for me to try to make progress really is to move the king
F6.
f6. Okay? Okay, let's see how this works. Okay, can black save the game? Okay, well, black could play check here. Black could play check here. What do you think about this check? Does that look like a good check? What would right respond? What would you do if you were white and black checked you there? Yeah, you're just going to push the pawn. You're already going to be threatening what?
Yeah.
You're already going to be threatening mate, right?
Yes. Oh, yeah.
And now he's going to go back to that passive position. And then how are you going to win?
Check.
No.
You remember how to win this?
H7.
Yeah, you just swing the rook to the other side. Remember that? Okay, swing the rook this. Now, assuming you have room, if these two files weren't here, the G and H, and I was actually over there on the rook file, then I wouldn't really have room to do that, would I? And it really would be a draw. Does that make sense? Okay, but let's back this up. So apparently, checking him there wasn't a good idea. So we could. What's the other kind of check? Well, we can try checking him here. Let's see how that works out. Okay. Now the king moves here. Now this is incredibly important. I'll tell you why. Because you are in one of the most critical positions you could have as the defender. Does that make sense? You're now threatened with checkmate. His king is even closer than it was before when we first started. His king is in the vicinity. The enemy king is in the vicinity where it can try to help push the pawn. And so this is a dangerous situation for us. But this position is a draw.
Because you're going to put your rook on D2. Right? Okay.
Well, it's now, I'm threatening mate, right?
Yeah, it's black to play, right?
Right, so what could black do to get a draw from this?
Rook D2, right?
Okay, rook to D2. Okay, right here.
Yeah, correct.
Okay, and then if I check him now, what's going to happen?
I'll bring my rook down.
Okay, and then he'll bring the rook back. And if you're white, what are you going to do?
You cannot take because...
If you take,
If you're white,
and the king moves over to take back,
yes.
Well, he has to take. If white takes, he wins.
then it offers my king an opportunity, doesn't it?
Because of quick, the king's going to go...
Right now, it's perfect opposition, right, for the kings. And so he's stopping my king from making progress. But if we capture, then what? Now the king takes back, and now the king can go off the side, right, and help escort the pawn. He's just going to win. Okay, so can you tell that this is totally lost?
Yes.
Okay, so rook d2 is a blunder, but this is a draw. Okay, this is a draw. So how can we draw this? Okay, well, it might not seem like it, but there's normally what you do in these kind of positions is you move the king, and usually they move it to what they call the shorter side. Because I have this side to move to, which is, notice there's 1, 2, 3, 4 squares that way, moving to the left, to the enemy's left. And there's 1, 2, 3 squares this way. So they call this the longer side, and they call this the shorter side, especially when you're talking about rook and pawn endgames. Okay? So let's suppose, so we normally try to move to the shorter side. Let's see what happens. Just move the king to the shorter side. Okay, so what can white do to try to win?
Check.
Okay, yeah, he's going to have to try to push the rook check, right? We could try pushing the king up. We'll look at that too. But but he plays check, right? The king moves here. How do we try to win this? Or would you think that as the defender, do you think that you're losing this position? What do you think, Dave?
Well, you always said it was a
Would you,
draw.
if you're black, yeah. It's actually a draw, but doesn't it look like your king has been pushed out of his position and blocking the pawn, and the black king has been pushed out of the way so the white king can make progress. You think that white's making some progress here, right?
You think that white can play king d7, for example.
Okay, yeah. So let's try king d7. Let's take a look at that. Okay, and now it's black's turn to move. What can he do?
Check.
Okay, so I could play check.
No. Check.
Check here.
G7.
check where?
G7 or whatever.
Okay, G7 is where the king is right now.
F7.
F7? Okay, just check on F7. Okay. So, and then the king moves where? The king moves to, well, if he wants to help the pawn advance, he's going to move his king back here, right?
Yes.
Would you agree? If he goes back here,
This is a
then the rook just goes back to where it was. We didn't make any progress. So he's going to have to try this, right? And now what could black do?
Check again.
No, you can't.
Oh, no.
No, you
Sorry,
can't.
sorry.
Yeah, I can.
Okay. How about if we move the rook to here, back to where we started? What do you think about that? Okay. Can white win this? Okay. Can white win this?
At this point, can he just keep on pushing the pawn?
I'm sorry?
Can he just push the pawn now?
Push the pawn to e6?
Yeah.
Okay. Looks like a good candidate, right? We're getting ready, we're trying to queen. How does black stop him?
Pins him.
Well, now,
He can pin it.
can he bring his king to here? What do you think? And try to get on that pawn. Try to apply pressure to that pawn with his king. Or is there an issue? What's the geometry of the black pieces when the king goes there?
Oh yeah, no. He could be checked and drop the rook.
They're both in the same file. Do you see it? Okay, so that doesn't make any sense. He's just going to check from behind. So the only thing he's going to be able to do is to check him, right? Or maybe swing the king over here and hope that he can check him from the side. Okay, so let's look at both approaches. Let's look at this check. Where's the king go? Well, the king could try going there. Okay, and now what? Well, we can't move the king any closer. We'd have to move our rook over to the side, right? Okay, there's not really much else we could try just a waiting move. But can white make any progress here? What's stopping this pawn from advancing?
The king.
Okay.
The king.
As long as
So it'd be a natural move for white to look because of that. Look for it because of that. If the king's blocking the pawn,
D6, right?
well, he can't move here because
Oh,
the
you
rook's
can't
got
move,
cut, right?
Sorry.
Where's the only place he can move the king?
It's E8.
E8? Okay, so what do you think of that? Okay, look okay. And then what can black do? Well, he could just like move the rook up or back. He could try keep him cut off.
Go to H5.
He could try going. He can try going over here, but then he can't. He can only check him here and not there because his own king is in the way. If he tries to check, right?
Yeah, but
So-
if he has the threat of the check on the back rank, picking up the rook.
Okay. But in that position, okay. But in this position, then white can check him first, right?
Right.
Okay, that's one possibility.
Yeah.
Okay. But if he checks him, then that might be an issue because the king goes here. Okay, how are we looking? Does it look like we're winning?
No, wait.
Yeah, yeah, it does. Yeah, white's winning because white does what?
Checks.
How can white win this?
Oh,
You don't want to check because his king just hit the pawn. And I'd like to for you to back away from the position for just a second. I want to talk to you for just a second. Okay, when you're studying, let's say, bishop and pawn endgames, or knight and pawn endgames, or rook and pawn endgames, the best way to study them is to start from the most critical positions, or in other words, with the pawns as far advanced as possible. Already threatening the queen, and the enemy king or the defending king is trying to stop that advance, and then asking yourself, well, can the attacker or the person with the extra material actually win? And then if you examine what happens on the 7th rank with the pawn, then you back it up and you say, okay, what about the pawn on the 6th rank?
And actually, I think you're right because it does
Is
want
it?
to win.
Yeah. Yes.
It does.
And then what happens to the pawn on the 5th rank? But do you guys see what I mean by approach to studying endgames? that's one of the things that bothers me about studying the Philidor, because the pawn's in the 5th rank. It's not very critical yet. But if I really want to understand the endgame, and this endgame included more, I'm going to have to put the king in a more critical position, where the pawn's already on the 6th or 7th, and keep asking myself questions. Could you actually win in this position or that position? And then I'll back it up to the 5th rank. Does that kind of make sense? Okay. So here, yeah, I advanced the pawn. And now notice the check that you were looking for, Dave. That check doesn't work anymore.
Right.
You see it because he just moves the king out of the way and he's threatening the queen. There's one last Hail Mary that black has. He could try this and then pin the pawn. But now how do I win?
I check your king.
I'm sorry? What can white
Check
do?
the king?
Yes, just check the king.
Yes.
That's one way to win. Okay, then his king, if his king goes here or here, I can just queen.
Queen, yes.
So his king would have to go here, here, hoping to keep that pawn pinned. But now how's white win? Or would you, by the way, would you say that black king is close enough to really cause trouble for white?
No, it's all over.
He's so far away, there's no
Because,
issues, right?
Yeah, king, E8, D8, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
And it's over.
Remember, in front of the pawn, sometimes they can just check you away, but there,
Yeah, that's it.
you make room for the pawn to advance in case of the check, right? So that just wins. Okay? Okay, so let's back this up.
I gotta go, guys.
Okay.
Good night. Thank
Okay,
you.
see ya.
Okay.
Yeah.
Bye.
Okay, so we can see how this became an issue very quickly. Okay? Okay, so we went there. Okay, so it was. So in this position, when we went to the back rank, white did what? White pushed the pawn. Okay, that was one way for white to try to cause trouble, and it looked like checking wasn't getting the job done, wasn't getting us a draw. But if we can't check him, and we can't get our king closer, we can't keep him cut off at all, then guess what? He's going to win this, right? He's going to win this, okay? Then, he's always threatening to push the pawn and then just get a queen. And we saw the check wasn't effective. Eventually, white was winning that, okay? Okay, so let's try that again. So check there. He goes there. Okay, and what was white's? We played rook d2, and what was white's winning idea?
To push the pawn. So to push the pawn.
He needs to push the pawn. You have to move the king.
first.
So you push the king forward, and then you advance, right? Okay. So you're always trying that. There's actually positions like this that are a draw, but not this position. Okay. So we can see that this is actually not. This is not a draw if we push the rook. If we checked him first, and then we brought the rook all the way back here. How about if the rook swings over to this side? Notice that with respect to the pawn, this is the longer side, and checks on the longer side are often much more effective than checks on the shorter side. Okay, where the king might be able to zigzag around and threaten our rook. Okay, so now notice that white can't win. Okay, this actually was effective. Okay, because if he pushes the pawn, then we can just do what? Okay, we check him there. Let me try that. Okay, can he make progress? This king? We check him again. No, he can't even block with a rook, can he? Okay, maybe he can come back to here and then block checks with his king. What's the problem with the king moving back to here? What do you think? The king is moving away from what? Moving away from the pawn.
And then you
Who
can
does
check
that?
the king on if it's
So now the check isn't really that big of a deal. You could check him and force his king to go right back into where he's defending the pawn and repeat the position. Or you could bring your king over, threaten the pawn, because his king, if his king's not going to defend his own pawn, then we have a much better chance here. Our king is able to come in and make threats, help make threats. Okay, so you can see that this is actually a way to draw this. But what I'd like to show you is another way to try to draw this, okay? And this is one that has been shown in a lot of books. You can try this kind of draw, okay? And the idea is to get in behind the pawn, okay? And if your king can get over there too, then that works out great. But right now, what can white do? Well, white could try, obviously he's got to try advancing the pawn at some point. So let's suppose he advances the pawn. And now, if we play check, what happens? This is very similar to what? Isn't that similar to the position we just had?
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is not working, is it? Okay. So how about if we bring the king over? Is that going to be effective? He's threatening the pawn. Now his rook and king are on the pawn, but what can he do? What can white do to change the situation?
Check the king.
Yeah, I can just check the king away, can't he? And then when the king's checked away, then he can just push the pawn and win, right? Okay. Okay, so let's go back. Okay, so the king moves here. Okay. And then the white king moved here. Okay. So it looks like what? It looks like this was actually a pretty good drawing method, wasn't it? Does that make sense? How about if we check him over here? What do you think? Does he reach that same winning position? Well, you'd think instead of blocking his pawn at, right there, right away, he'd want to give some room for his king. His king would want to give some room for the pawn to advance. So let's suppose he goes there. Okay? Now he's threatening to do what? Well, he's threatening to advance the pawn. Okay? Now let's suppose we get in behind the pawn and we attack it. What do you think? Is that going to work? Well, if we push the pawn,
No, because
we have a very similar position, don't we? For example, if you move the rook, here, this would be the same thing we had before, right? Okay, so let's back it up. Okay, so just attacking the pawn doesn't seem to be very effective. So what could we do to try to draw this? If you were black. There's always two kinds of checking patterns you're looking for in trying to control the king. Either you're checking him from behind. What's the other type of check?
side.
You're either trying to check him from behind
Side.
and create problems for the attacking king, or you can move the rook over to the side. Let's try that. Now can white win? Notice a lot of those other positions we were looking at the rook from being behind, right? But what if our rook is on the side now? Now we're threatening what? We're threatening just to sit there and check him. And you think, well, if these checks are a problem, maybe he can just move his rook back here, right? Stop the check, and then continue to advance the pawn. What do you think? Okay. Now what can black do?
Black's going to go to 6th rank.
To the 6th rank? Okay. Okay, let's see how that works. And then we can do what? Then we can start trying to do what? To
Push.
advance the pawn.
You're not going to make...
Okay. So is this a draw?
yes, it is a draw.
Okay. So let's say he what? Stays on the pawn?
Mm-hmm.
Does that look reasonable? Okay. What happens? This is a problem because even though I'm staying on the pawn, what can white do now to make progress? He can move it. He can move his king over and attack the rook and get out of the way of the pawn and threaten to advance the pawn. Right? That makes sense. Okay. So it looks like if he advances the pawn, it doesn't look like we can just slide the rook over. Okay. What can we do now? Well, what was that Philidor's idea? We make the pawn advance, and then we can try what? We can try going to the back rank. Maybe that will work. Let's try that out. Okay. So I go to the back rank. How does white make progress? You can try and move his king forward, right? With a check. Okay. But moving the king forward is moving the king away from the pawn. Okay, so what can black do?
Attack it, yeah.
Could try attacking the pawn. Okay, can we win?
No.
Okay, no, this is a problem, isn't it? Okay, because if we try advancing the pawn, okay, then what's he going to do?
We're gonna put the rook. Ooh. We put the rook right behind on E1, right?
Okay, put the rook where?
E1.
E1.
Oops.
Okay. What if white places king here?
Yeah, you're right. Yeah.
Okay.
No, that doesn't work.
Yeah, or how about here? Okay. Well, here the place the black king could just come back and stop it, couldn't it? Can it? Does that really stop the pawn from advancing? Because now the king and rook attack that square. Is that working?
It's winning for white. It's gonna queen.
Yeah, because it's going to queen with check, right? So guess what? If we're threatening the queen and he can't stop and we can't do anything about it, I'm guessing we're going to win this. Now, as one last Hail Mary, he could try checking here, and then that would force us to.
Yeah.
We could try defending, right? Okay. And let me see. Now he could go over here. Okay. And now if we queen, that's a problem for us because he could do what?
You can check us and take the queen.
Check and take the queen. But there's a different approach. What happens if, let's say, we play check there? Now the king can go back here. It's threatening our rook. What do you think? What is black's threat as soon as we move the rook away? What's black going to try to do?
Take the rook. But
No. As soon as we move the rook away, what's black going to try to do?
check us.
Yeah, it's going to try to check us. And if he can check us and prevent us from queening, then of course that's the only chance he has. Our rook, if it stays though on that rank, it keeps the king cut off. Does that make sense? And if we want to stop checks, then one way to do that is to prepare to block them. What do you think about that? Now what's black going to do to stop me from queening? Now that I've prepared to block the check. It's all over, isn't it? Right? Does that make sense? Okay, so let's go back now. Okay, so now we know that that wasn't a very good move to just get right behind the pawn. Okay. How about if we move the rook here? Okay. What does black do? What does white do now? Well, white needs to advance the pawn to get a queen. Now we have a kind of we're close to the Lucena position, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So the white king move what? White king move to
G8.
there, F8, right? Get ready to queen, and what's he going to do about it? Doesn't look like he can do anything. If he goes there, we just get a queen, right? Are you sure? If he goes there, we just get a queen? What's the problem with that?
He's going to be able to take it away.
No, he's going to check us right there, and where are we going to go? If we get a queen right now and he checks us right there, where do we go?
So he's already got it.
Yeah, if he gets a queen and black checks us right there, where do we go? Yeah, mate, checkmate. Yes. Okay, so we'd have to do something to stop that. What would that be?
What? Get the king out of the way.
Yeah, just move the king away. Just check him. And once again, we're driving the king away from the area where the king can support or help stop the pawn, or or attack squares where the enemy king would be trying to move their king so they can prepare to advance the pawn. But now we can't do anything about it. Now he moves back, he moves out of the situation, and we just queen, right? Does that make sense? Because even if he checks us, we just move the king back. He's going to have to give up his rook for the queen, and I think we might be able to win a rook and king versus king. We might be able to win that one. Okay. So let's go back. So is there a way to draw this? Is there a way to draw this? What happens if the rook, let's say, goes here? What do you think? Just lets me do whatever I want. How do I win this?
King.
Move the king?
King F8.
King F8, exactly. Okay? So apparently that's no good. So is there a way to draw this? It looked critical, doesn't it? Looks like, oh my gosh, white's got to win. How about if we check here? Check the king there. Okay. We got to move the king where? Got to move the king
But there is only one square.
there. There's only one square. Now let's suppose he moves his king here to stop us from queening. Can we win this? Look at this really carefully. Because this is, can you tell that this is incredibly critical? He's about ready to queen, right? And black is doing everything he can to stop that pawn from advancing. But this is critical, right? This is a critical position because he's right there ready to queen, but with the king there and the rook here, we're stopping that pawn from advancing. So how is white going to do this? What's the problem? What's the problem for white if he tries to move the rook away from this rank here?
Okay.
But it's going to be checked.
He's going to check and
there's going to be 2 on the pawn and the pawn's going to fall.
okay. Let's take a look at that. Okay, so he checks us here. We move here, and now what?
And now
Just take the pawn.
let me see. No.
This is one of the most classic ideas that you're watching for all the time when you're looking at variations in rook and pawn versus rook endgames. You can't take the pawn here, right?
Yeah.
Because as soon as you take the pawn, you put yourself in a situation where your king has to sit there and guard that pawn.
That's right.
So if he can start checking you or check you away, you're in big trouble. Can you tell that you're going to lose if you take that pawn?
Yeah, you're going to, yeah.
Yeah. So if black can't take it, how in the world is he going to get a draw? How about if we check him again? See it? What can white do? He's got to move right back there, and isn't that the position we just had?
Yes.
Okay, so checks here. And we can right? Okay. So now we can see why this is a draw. You can still mess this up though. It's that critical. You could play check and try to just take his pawn, but that would lose. Right? Notice how close this pawn is ready to queen. Knowing what's going on in this position will help you understand, and tell me if this makes sense, Alex. It will help you understand what's going to happen if the pawn is in the 6th rank or the pawn is back in the 5th rank. Does that make sense? If I understand all the situations with the pawn in the 7th rank, then I can study on the 6th or 5th. Now that's actually also a huge idea in Nunn's book. Nunn's got a whole book on rook and pawn versus rook, and he starts out with the most critical positions, pawn on the 7th, then in different files, pawn on the 6th, then he goes back to pawn on the 5th, and so on and so forth. With the theory that you want to understand all the critical situations with the pawn on the 7th first, and then you go back to 6th and 5th. And you do that for other endgames too. If it's knight and pawn versus knight, bishop and pawn versus bishop, and so on and so forth. And if I understand knight and pawn versus knight, then maybe I can understand knight and 2 pawns versus knight and 1 pawn. Or bishop and 2 pawns versus bishop and 1 pawn, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So here, here you can tell we actually have a draw. Okay. If white does what? Okay. Let's go back to the situation where white moved the rook away from the pawn. Okay, so apparently I can't move the rook away from the pawn. You can see that that's a problem. Okay, so what can he do? How can white make progress here? Can he queen?
No.
Nope. Just loses the queen, loses the pawn. He just takes it. Okay, he can give us a check, but so what? Just move our king away. So he can't move the rook anywhere along here. Does this move look like it's making progress?
Rook to c7.
Well, maybe that blocks this.
Yeah.
But let's look a little bit further than that. Let's suppose we were already here and we played this move. Would that be winning?
No.
Okay.
No, because he would just snap it off and take our pawn, right? So it looks like this isn't much of a goal to be looking for. Okay? If I can see that even, and this is one of the critical things that we do in analysis, is to judge an idea, I might look ahead a couple moves and say, well, let's suppose my opponent gives me everything. He lets me get to that position. Then I've got to be telling myself, what? Is this really winning? If I argue that first, early on, then I don't waste my time analyzing something if I realize, well, I'm not going to get anywhere with that position anyway. Okay? But we have this tendency to want to analyze all the way up to that position instead. Okay? Instead of saying, okay, what's my target? And if I achieve all my goals or some of my goals, is this really effective? Okay? So so in any case, can you tell here that white cannot win this? Okay? Would it help if white moved his king back, do you think?
No.
No.
Because rook e8.
Yeah. Okay, so king there, right? You're saying rook e8, right? And now his king can't do what? His king can't move forward anywhere because it gets to snap the pawn off. He can't move the rook away. What do you think? Can he move the rook away? Can black just take the pawn now? You're worried about that other situation, right?
Yes.
If the rook takes the pawn, then my king has to guard it.
Yes.
So if he starts checking me away, am I okay, right?
Uh-huh.
Okay. But if he takes the pawn and he gives you this one check, the king can move here.
Yes.
You see it? And now you see that black is drawing. Okay. Okay. So let's go back to that situation we were just looking at. So what's the way? If we push the pawn here, what's the way for black to draw? Even though his king has been driven out and away from the pawn, or out from it, blocking the pawn directly, right, on the same file, and even though that pawn is all the way up to the 7th rank, can we win? Can black draw? And now you see what the drawing idea is, right? Okay, what was the drawing idea? You saw all these losing ideas, right? We looked at that. That loses. We saw that loses, right? But what? He has one drawing idea, and that is what? To check there. Notice that black's king is close enough to block the white king from coming out this way, right? And remember, in some of those positions, if he went there, he was winning, right? But when we check him here, he's forced to go to the other side of the pawn. And then what? How did we get the draw?
We swing over.
We move the king. Can't swing over.
No.
He's just going to queen.
Yeah, the king to f7.
Picks up.
You see how important it is that I understand this position. Even more important than that Philidor, okay, they want us to look at. Because I'm looking at the pawn all the way in the 7th rank. I'm looking at him just about ready to queen and saying, can I really defend this? Okay? And if I understand those positions, then I can look at, once again, the pawns in the 6th, the 5th rank, and then I'll have a much better ways of judging, whether or not I can win this position. And so you can see why I look at these, why I look at the idea of the Philidor. Let's go all the way back here, okay? And I look at it with some criticism because, yes, that's a method that we can get a draw, but there are other ways to get a draw, isn't there? Okay, we saw other ways to draw this We tried. We can tell that there's one way to lose. One way to lose is this, because then when we advance the pawn, but advance the king here, we can't check him from behind. You see what's going on? Okay. We advance the king here, and now we can't check him from behind, and so we're threatening this series of moves. The rook up check, the king moves up, the pawn up check, king moves up, the rook over check. You see it? So it's a sequence of moves that's going to win here for white. Okay? So that is a losing move. Okay? But if we try something like this, even though it's not the Philidor idea, cutting him off in the this rank first, it still ends up drawing, doesn't it? Okay? Okay, so what I want to do now is I'm going to look at a couple other positions where we've made a lot more progress, where the pawn is closer, the critical positions, right? Let's go ahead and set up a couple more, or maybe another couple of critical positions, and take a look at those. Okay, so what can black do? Okay, what can black do in this position? He's threatened with checkmate. Looks like we're about ready to drive him out. Notice that we weren't able to achieve, apparently, Philidor's position, if that's the way we started here, because we didn't cut him off and then force the pawn to advance first, right? His king is now comfortably in front of the pawn. We can't check him from behind. He's threatening checkmate. Okay? So can I get a draw here? Very, very critical idea. Can I get a draw here? Okay? As black. What would you suggest? What are the candidate moves for black? What are the moves that black can play at all? Well, one of the easiest things to do is to analyze the king moves, because there's going to be a lot more rook moves to analyze, right? Okay? So what are the king moves he can make? Well, he can move his king to f8, or he can move his king to d8. Would you agree?
Yeah.
Okay. And based on what we talked about, the long and the short side, which would you think would be the first way for us to approach this? Moving to the long side or to the short side? What do you think?
First, be the short side.
The short side. So let's take a look at that. Okay, what do you think? Can we draw this? Okay. Well, how does white make progress? That's our question. Well, normally notice that, like, for example, when the rook was like on this file, we could advance the king when his king was out of the way. We could advance the king and then push the pawn, right? And we were already getting close to a threatening win. He may still be able to draw it, but it becomes more and more difficult. But now we can advance the king because his king is so close, is guarding these squares, and obviously we can't go here and just give up the pawn. So the only way for us to make progress is what? Would it make sense for us to put our king here or here?
No, because we're going to check.
He's going to check us from behind, right? That makes sense? So the only way for us to make progress is to do what? Check him there. King goes where? King goes here. And now the only way we're going to advance the pawn is to move the king here to where?
Yeah.
Because there he just grabs the pawn. Notice the advantage of him having the rook here. Staying on that pawn. You can't just freely move anywhere he wants and give plenty of room for the pawn to move because we snap the pawn off. The only way he's going to make progress is to move the king here. Okay? Well, he's moving the king here. He's getting ready to advance. What do you think? Is checking him a good idea?
Sure.
Okay. What if his king now goes here instead of here? Instead of e6, it goes to e7. Do you recognize this position? The pawn was on the 6th rank, right? Okay. Well, before the pawn was on the 6th rank with the rook on the d file, right? So can we get a draw with this?
But if I should push the pawn, huh?
Okay. Well, it's now whose turn? White just moved his king to e7. It's black's turn. So we can try lateral checks, right? We can go over to the side. Let's say we go to this file. And can we win this? Can white win this? Notice that the rook is pretty close to the white king. Okay, he's threatening the lateral checks. How can we make? What is the obvious way for white to try to make progress?
Push the pawn.
He's got to push the pawn, right? So let's try that. Let's see if that wins. Okay. Now it's black's turn to move. Okay, what can he do?
Check. Yeah.
You can try check. Well, that's the whole point of moving to the side, right? To try these lateral checks. Then we move our king back. Remember that we were actually drawing that in one of the other positions, but our rook was on the rook file, further away from the white king. Does that make sense, Alex? It was on the rook file, and we could check him from afar. But now notice how close we are when we're checking the enemy king. Okay, we're right there real close where he could, if we just keep checking him, for example, what's he going to do? He's eventually going to move his king where? He could try his king here. Is that going to make progress for him?
Yep.
Yeah, it is.
It
This
is.
is going to be a problem, isn't it?
Yeah.
Okay. We could try now going here. That looked pretty good. What do you think?
No,
We hit the
because
pawn?
king's gonna attack the rook.
Yes. The king comes back, threatens the rook, and threatens to push the pawn. If the rook moves away, we can push the pawn. That's already a threat, right? Threatening the queen. So that isn't looking good. Okay? And if he can't stay, can he stay on this file? Keep that pawn cut off? No. So this is not looking good. He's now managed to drive our rook away. And now where's the winning move? What's the easy way for us to win? As white.
Rook and check.
I'm sorry?
Look at the white rook and check. King wait.
Yeah. The white rook can check him. Isn't that a way to win?
Yes.
Are you sure?
It's because
Where are you driving the king? Where are you driving that king?
Oh.
You're driving that king right on to the
close
pawn.
to the pawn, yes.
How are you going to win this?
No, you can't.
You can't. It's done. It's over. It's draw. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. We just messed that one up. What's another way for us to try to win here? What's our whole goal here?
It's to push the pawn.
To push the pawn, right? Okay, so if we push the pawn, what can he do to stop us from queening?
He can't, because then you're gonna attack the rook again. Because
Yeah.
You're gonna push your pawn.
He could try.
your king.
Yeah, he can try checking us. If his king moves closer, does that help? No, we just queen with check. If his rook goes on the pawn and our pawn's already in the 7th, does that help? Well, no, we just queen anyway. The only thing you can try right now is to check from behind, right? So he checks us and, or I'm sorry, you push the pawn, he checks us, and can he just keep on checking them?
No,
Us.
because the king's gonna.
King's going to do this zigzag
Right.
pattern, right, as he checks us, and just come back and be threatening the rook and threatening queen at the same time. Does that make sense? Okay. So I go back. Let's go back here. Now we see an issue. Okay. Okay, now we see that checking him is a bad idea. But this is actually a draw. Even though his last move was to move out of the way and get ready to queen, as long as he doesn't, as long as we don't check him, which is actually the critical mistake here, okay? And instead we look at what? Well, the rook is on that file, the same file where the pawn is. It's hitting the e6 square, right? Okay? So the pawn wouldn't be able to advance if we did something else? What would stop his pawn from advancing? He's ready to advance. We know the check isn't helping us. We know that going to the side didn't really help us. Okay, if we go to the side, is that going to... We remember how critical that was? That wasn't really helping us, right? He's pushing the pawn, and then he could zigzag over there and get us. He's so close to where our rook is trying to check him. Okay? But the drawing idea is to move the king closer. That's one of the most important things about this endgame. When you have the rook behind the pawn, and your king hits that square where the pawn's going to advance,
It's over. It's a draw.
now, the only way, since he can't push the pawn to queen, and you're threatening to just check him to death, right?
Mhm.
His only way to make progress is for him to check you. Where are you going to go? Where do you want to move your king?
you're gonna move your king to f6.
Okay, to f6.
Yes.
Well, the
Right.
pawn's there.
Oh,
Yeah, if he takes your taking pawn takes king is strong.
and it is strong.
Pawn takes king
Yes,
is
it
strong. Okay.
I'm so sorry.
So- And then so we could try. How about if we just go back to where we were at? How about e8?
Okay.
If he checks us, what do we do? Go back to f7. Guard that square. If he checks us again, we go back to e8. So now what's white going to try? Well, he could try moving his king over here, since he can't push his pawn, because what's going to happen? If he
Because
pushes the
he's gonna
pawn,
check,
he's just going to check the king, right? So the only way to make progress is to move the king over here and be threatening that same kind of checkmate. But we have already looked at this
Yeah, because we're gonna
in a
go
slightly different setting. What's going to be the drawing idea when he's threatening checkmate? To do what?
to the short side.
Move the king to the short side. Notice how we're back in the same kind of position. Does that make sense? Now, so my whole point in showing a lot of this was that if you're looking at all these critical positions where the pawn's in the 7th or the pawn's in the 6th or the king and the pawn are pushing your king away, okay? And you know, notice he can check you and then push your king, looks like 2 files away from the pawn, and yet it's still a draw. Okay, if you know how to draw it. If he tries to move out of the way, we do what?
Check.
I'm sorry?
No.
You don't check. He goes to king e7 and then suddenly he's winning. Okay? Remember, we didn't. If we tried the lateral checks, his king was too close. Okay? But the square that he's threatening to advance the pawn on, we do what for?
You protect it.
You move the king over there and you guard it. And our mind tells us, well, we can't do that because he's just going to check us away. Are you seeing why it's not that easy to tell that that's the right move? But if you just check him and when he checks you, you move the king back to e8. He can try king e6 and try to checkmate. You play king f8, and we're back to where we started. Okay. You can't push the pawn. You see why this is so important to look at? Now you know more about why the Philidor was a draw, but you know that you can draw with other ways, other techniques too. Notice that the defending rook is right there behind the pawn too, in this situation. Okay? Okay, guys.
Thank you.
I'm hoping you're enjoying this endgame. I know it's a lot of work. It's a lot of work there, but looking this over, I think you're going to really enjoy what this means. You know, you're going to say, wow, now I know if the pawn's in the 7th or 6th, I can see a lot of critical positions where this isn't going to win. Okay? If I play this right as the defender, I know how to draw it. And by the way, playing this right as the defender tells me a lot about how I would play this as the attacker. It's even easier to attack right, usually, than to defend in this endgame situation. In middle games, different situations, sometimes you're the defender and you only have one choice. And right, there's a very common remedy. Okay, guys, that's
Thank
it.
you.
All right, thank you.